This is the 7th session of our series Rome, the Early Emperors, and today I would like to talk about the imperial women. Here is, as the cover image, a representation of the Emperor Nero as a young man. He is 17 at the time, and he is being crowned. He's not being crowned by a personification of Rome. He's not being crowned by a goddess. He's being crowned by his mother, Agrippina, the last wife of the Emperor Claudius. This is a group of statues from Aphrodisias in Turkey, and it is a remarkably accurate representation of what happened. Agrippina did indeed put the crown on Nero's head. She got herself into Claudius's bed. She became his last wife. She then made sure that Claudius effectively disinherited his own son, Britannicus, in favour of Nero. When she murdered Claudius, she made sure to keep news of the death quiet until she had sorted out the acclamation of her son by the Praetorian Guard. She made him the emperor, and then for the next few years, maybe the next 3 or 4 years, she was virtually the prime minister of the empire, or perhaps she was the regent of the empire. So this is a very revealing statue. It is Nero being crowned emperor by his mother, which is a representation of the truth. But remember, it is not simply the case that Agrippina got her son acclaimed as emperor and then stepped back saying, "There, I have achieved my mission in life." No, she was quite happy for Nero to spend his time lying flat with lead sheets on his chest to strengthen his singing voice, so that she could get on with the business that she really had in mind, which was to run the empire herself, so that she could receive foreign ambassadors, she would go into conferences with senators, she would make the important policy decisions. That appears to have been her intention. She achieved her intention, and she continued to rule the empire, by all accounts rather well, until Nero grew old enough to become resentful of the guiding strings his mother had put around him, and he drifted into, shall we say, a period of hostility with his mother that ended only with his murder of his mother. So this is an interesting representation. There are 3 women I want to cover in some detail today. One of them, of course, is Agrippina the Younger, the daughter of Germanicus, the great-granddaughter of Augustus, and I believe the great-granddaughter of Mark Antony. I want also to cover her mother, Agrippina the Elder, who was ultimately a failure insofar as Tiberius had her locked up on an island and starved to death. But she was before then a most remarkable woman. She was before then a very important woman in Roman politics. And then I want to look at the Empress Livia, the wife of Augustus, the woman who possibly had a substantial share in the formation of the central institutions of the empire, and who appears to have been critically important to the administration of the empire for 50 years. Before then, however, let's have a look at the general position of women within the Roman Empire. And as I said in the warm-up for this session, it is possible for a woman to achieve a position of leadership within a society that is absolutely hostile to the idea that women should have any kind of leadership position, or a society that is very hostile to the idea of a woman's existence outside the home. It is possible for a woman to do that, but it is much less likely to happen. The fact that the women in the imperial family, and I could have looked beyond the three women I've chosen. I could look, for example, at Messalina, the wife of Claudius, though her independence and her authority was far less creative and worth studying than that of the three women I have chosen. It is possible to look at these women in isolation, but it is also useful to look at them in the context of what was expected of a woman, or what was tolerated of a woman in the late Republican and early imperial periods in Rome. So let's begin with the legal theory of the status of women. There was in every Roman household, in theory, a father, the father of the household, who enjoyed the patria potestas, the fatherly power, and this was an absolute power. The head of the household, the father, had absolute power over his wife and over all his children, and of course over all his slaves, and over all of the various dependents who might live under the same roof. This power, in theory and sometimes in fact, extended to the right to inflict capital punishment on his wife and children. And during the early and middle Republican periods of Roman history, there are stories, mostly in Livia, which means that you can believe them or cast doubt on them, but I don't think there's any point in casting doubt on the general ability. But there are stories in the early and middle Republican periods of men who exercised their powers as the head of the household and did have wives and sons put to death for various actual or suspected derelictions of duty. Again, in legal theory, only the father, only the man who possessed the patria potestas had any rights in private law. Only the head of the household was able to take legal action. Only the head of the household could have private legal action taken against him. Only the head of the household had any property rights. If you were the wife of the head of the household, your property passed into his ownership. If you were the son, if you were a son, and you acquired property, again, in legal theory, that property did not belong to you, it belonged to the head of the household. This patria potestas ended only with the death of the head of the household, but then of course there would be a new head of the household. That being said, however, it was possible for the head of the household to emancipate a child or some other dependent by a formal grant of freedom. But apart from that, in legal theory, a father or the head of the household had absolute and unaccountable power over all of his dependents. Look at this picture on the right. I can't say exactly where I found that, but this is a representation of a legal fact in Rome and sometimes also in Greece. If a child is born, the child is taken to the head of the household, to the father, and he looks at it. If he decides he doesn't like it, he can say, get rid of it, take it outside the walls, expose it, and let it be taken off by the wild animals. As such, the father, the big daddy in the household, has rejected this child. It is a legal nullity. It can be taken out and left for wild animals to take and eat. If, on the other hand, he picks the child up, he has accepted it, and it then has certain customary rights with regard to maintenance. You don't have that in modern societies, but the power of the head of the household was so absolute that it was his choice whether he accepted a newborn baby into the household or whether he rejected it. This is something which you do see in many Greek city-states, and you can think of many mythological stories, Oedipus, for example, where a child is rejected. It's exposed on a hilltop, but in those stories the child is miraculously saved. What about women? Obviously, as a wife or a daughter, a woman came within this patria potestas system. When a woman married, again in legal theory, she would pass from the power of her father into the power of her husband, and so marriage was not necessarily a liberation for a woman. And even when a woman was not married, let's suppose that she was divorced, or let's suppose that she was widowed, or let's suppose that she had always been single, if her father died, that was not an end to the male domination of women. A woman was expected to pass under the care of a guardian who would exercise some of the functions of this patria potestas. Before a woman could make a contract, before a woman could transfer property, before a woman could take a whole range of actions, it was necessary to do so with the consent of her guardian. That being said, it was possible for a woman to choose her guardian, and it was possible for a woman to replace her guardian if she found him inconvenient. But this takes me into another part of what I have to say today. For the moment, although we can say that by the late Republic and by the time of the early Empire, the patria potestas had been steadily reduced and would continue to be reduced, it remains the case that a woman was, in legal theory and sometimes in fact, always subject to a man. Let's look at marriage, and this shows some of the loopholes in the patria potestas system. There were, under Roman law, 3 different kinds of marriage. This would once have seemed a little odd to us. 3 kinds of marriage? How on earth do you have that? You're married or you're not. But during the past few decades, we have found ourselves with 2 kinds of marriage. You have formal marriage, and then you have these civil partnership agreements, which are similar to, but not the same as, marriage. And you had something broadly similar under Roman law. 3 kinds of marriage. The first was conferiatio. This is the most ancient form of marriage. It is the form of marriage that was preferred among the older and the more conservative patrician families. In this kind of marriage, a woman passed into the absolute mastery of her husband, though because this was a form of marriage practiced, certainly in the early imperial period, only by the wealthiest and oldest and most conservative of the patrician families, it was offset in large degree by conveying the property of the married woman into a set of trusts which couldn't be touched by the husband, rather like upper-class marriages in England before the passing of the Married Women's Property Acts in the late 19th century. And so those women who married according to the most ancient form under Roman law, in theory, became the slaves of their husbands, but this was, in practice, offset by various trust arrangements. You then have coemptio, which is also ancient. It also provides the same status for a wife, and its difference from conferiatio is more historical than practical. But there is also the third kind of marriage, which is usus. We can translate that as cohabitation. There is no actual ceremony. I don't know if the phrase still exists, but when I was a boy, quite often in the neighbourhood where I lived, there were men and women who cohabited. They weren't married, they cohabited, and they might have been living together for 10 or 20 years. But for various reasons, quite often because they were already married, they didn't marry, they cohabited, and they referred to each other as my common-law husband. I believe it now has a certain legal recognition. It didn't have any when I was a boy, but that is similar to the Roman category of usus, cohabitation. A bit, I suppose, like a civil partnership. No, I don't think you can compare them. It was cohabitation. You lived together, and so long as a woman spent 3 nights per year away from her husband, she remained under the notional control of her father, and her husband had no rights over her property. This was the preferred form of marriage. By the time you come into the time of Augustus and moving into the 1st century, this is the preferred form of marriage in the Roman Empire. Not confarreatio, not coemptio, but just usus, or cohabitation. So long as the couple remained together, they had legally enforced expectations of each other, but divorce was very easy and very common. But this was the main form of marriage, and you can see at once that although the woman remained under the notional control of her father, she wasn't living in his house, she wasn't living under his roof, and as such his effective control over her was rather limited, which means that although in theory women were surrounded by legal restrictions on what they could do, in practice these restrictions meant very little. Here is a poem by Martial, a poet of the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. From the time when the Julian law Faustinus was revived, and modesty was ordered to enter Roman homes, it is now either less, or certainly not more, than the 30th day, and Telesilla is already marrying her 10th husband. She who marries so often cannot be said to marry at all. She is an adulteress under cover of the law. An avowed prostitute offends me less. It sounds better in Latin. Martial is never an entirely serious poet. He simply pours the most savage insults over the heads of people who have, for whatever reason, upset him, and Telesilla seems to be one of them. But marriage and divorce were very easy in the late Republic and early Imperial period, and it seems that there was no particular social prejudice against multiple divorce and multiple marriage. And remember that so long as the third kind of marriage, usus, was employed, a woman could marry and divorce and marry again and remain in complete control of her property, which meant that for rich women there were no particular restraints. If you look below the top layer of Roman society, we can see that women were able to engage in often very extensive business affairs. Remember when we spoke about Claudius and he wanted to ensure a ready grain supply for Rome? He ordered what amounts to state insurance of people willing to ship grain from Egypt during the winter months. In this law, he explicitly includes women. He says that either men or women willing to ship grain from Alexandria to Ostia will be eligible for this state insurance system. This shows that women were important in the shipping trade. We then have a series of legal documents from Herculaneum and Pompeii, which were destroyed in 79 AD. From Herculaneum we have the archive of a man called Sulpicius, a list of 300 transactions before October 79, 23 of these mention transactions with women, and there's a list of them there in bullet points. Petulchia Erotis, a freedwoman, confirms that she received 19,500 sesterces in an auction where her item was sold. This is a very large amount of money. It allows her to buy almost 40 tons of grain. There's Marcia Fausta, another freedwoman, a freed slave. She took a loan of 2,000 sesterces from a representative of the house. Then you have a freeborn Caesia Priscilla, who owed 24,000 sesterces to the Sulpici family. So women appear to have been able to, well, there's no appearance about it, women were able to make and receive substantial loans for trading purposes. Then, if we look at Pompeii, and here is a painting from her house in Pompeii, you have Julia Felix. She owned an entire block of properties in Pompeii, and in 79 AD, immediately before the eruption, she was offering domestic and business rentals, including some very expensive residential properties that included swimming pools and rights to use swimming pools, and she was offering those on 5-year leases. I don't need to go any further. I'm sure that if I had looked through all of the surviving legal writings, I would have found case after case after case of women involved at very high levels in business transactions. But just looking at the snapshot of daily life in Pompeii and Herculaneum show that women were involved in business transactions, and sometimes these were business transactions for very considerable amounts of money. There appear to have been no particular restraints on women's involvement in business. We know that women could be doctors, and we also know that women could be lawyers, and they could bring cases in the courts. In the time of Cicero, one of the other leading advocates in Rome was a man called Hortensius. He didn't have any sons, he had a daughter. He brought her up, made sure she had a good legal training, and she became one of the most famous advocates in Rome in the time of Cicero. I believe Tiberius tried to restrain women lawyers from bringing cases in the courts, but again, remember, it could often be very difficult for these laws to be enforced. So we do know that there were some women lawyers. We know that there were women doctors, we know that there were women scribes, we know that there were women doing almost everything outside the elected magistracies. Look at this. This is something that's become rather, shall I use the word sexy? Yes, this is an issue that's become rather sexy in the past 20 years. And I don't know what the truth is, but this is a marble relief. It's in the British Museum. It is 2 gladiators. It commemorates their release from service, their being freed. And the 2 gladiators shown here are called Amazon and Achillia, both female names. Does this mean that there were women gladiators? The answer is I don't know. We do have some evidence that women on exceptional circumstances fought in the arena. When in the reign of Nero, Tiridates, the king of Armenia, came to Rome on a state visit, he was the guest of honour at some games put on by Nero in which Ethiopian men, women and children fought against each other. But just generalising from that one instance doesn't mean that there were children gladiators, and it may mean that there were not women gladiators. But we do have this relief and the inscription, and it does suggest that there sometimes were female gladiators. It's just that it's very difficult to find any other evidence for them. Women and politics. Here we're drifting into much better established territory. And what you can say is that as in England before 1918, women were not eligible for any elected office and they were not able to vote. Well, that being said, I think women before 1918 in this country could vote in local elections. Also, it does seem that before 1832, some women did have the vote and were able to exercise it. But let's leave that aside. We're talking about Rome, not England. Women were not eligible for any elected office and they could not vote. This being said, women were expected, as in the 19th century, women in Rome were expected and they were able to take an active part in advancing the political careers of their husbands and their sons. Women could campaign for their menfolk. They could go around soliciting votes. They could use their own networks of contacts and they could use their own money to ensure the election of their husbands, their sons, their brothers, what have you. Which meant that although women couldn't actually stand for office, a woman could do everything short of that, because if you are directing a campaign, you'll be deeply involved in politics. If anyone has ever taken part in a general election campaign for the Conservative or Labour parties, you'll see that the backbone of these campaigns is all older women. You don't cross these women because they know what they're doing, they know what they want, and they don't need any guidance. And I should imagine it was much the same in Roman politics. We then have a very substantial difference between the Romans and the Greeks. And let's read this quotation from Cornelius Nepos, who was a Roman author, a biographer no less, of the 1st century BC. He says, "Many things in our habits are decorous, which by them, i.e. by the Greeks, are considered unbecoming. For what Roman is ashamed to bring his wife to a feast, or whose consort does not occupy the best room in the house and live in the midst of company? But in Greece, the case is far otherwise, for a wife is neither admitted to a feast, except among relations, nor does she sit anywhere but in the innermost apartment of the house, which is called the gynokonitis, and into which nobody goes who is not connected with her by near relationship." What we can say from this, and from much other evidence, is that in Athens to be sure, women in the upper classes pretty well wore the full hijab. They did not go out, and they were always under the control of a man, and they lived in separate parts of the house. If a male visitor came, the women would withdraw upstairs. It was indeed even considered a very grave insult to mention in public that a man was married, and completely unheard of to give the name of his wife. Whereas you don't have that in Rome. The women walk around, the women get involved in the politics, the women go to the theatres, there are women everywhere. Have a look at this representation of Augustus and his family, where you have an indiscriminate mingling of the male and female members of the family, and these are on public show in the art. Education. What you should take away from this slide is what I say right at the end. Female education is largely a matter of parental choice. It's neither required nor discouraged. Here is a painting, as usual, from Pompeii. It is a young girl reading. These are societies where the literacy rate is probably no greater than about 3%. It is about as literate as Western Europe was before 1350. Boys at the very top, elite boys, they would receive long and elaborate educations, rhetorical educations in both Greek and Latin, and this was training for positions in the law and in politics. Girls, because they had no professional careers and were often married at 13, they would learn to read and to write, but there was no customary prohibition of a good education for a girl, and we can see that many women in the imperial family were very well educated. Livia was able to correspond with Augustus. We have quotations from their correspondence in the biographies by Suetonius, and Augustus and Livia are writing to each other in highly literate prose containing Greek words and Greek quotations. Agrippina the Younger, she was able to rule the empire rather well for a number of years, and she also wrote her autobiography, now sadly lost, so women could enjoy very good educations. But it was a matter of the custom within a particular family. Now, that being said, let's have a look at these imperial women. The first of these we have discussed already at some length, Livia Drusilla, the first empress, the wife of Augustus, 58 BC to 29 AD. She was from an old aristocratic family, the Claudii. She was married at the age of 15 to her cousin Tiberius Nero, had 2 sons by him, Tiberius and Drusus. Then in 38 BC, she is divorced from her husband Tiberius Nero, and she marries Augustus. Augustus fell deeply in love with her, demanded that she should be divorced from her husband so that he could marry her, even though she was at the time pregnant with her younger son Drusus. Whatever the case, she was married to Augustus for 51 years, and in this time she was an accepted partner not only in the management of the empire, but in the establishment of the imperial institutions of the empire. We don't know to what extent she was responsible for the emergence of the Augustan settlement, but she had some part in its evolution. And even after Augustus died, she continued to be a woman of great importance for another 15 years after the death of Augustus until her own death. In the first instance, she played a critical role in ensuring the smooth transfer of power from her dead husband to her son Tiberius. In the second place, she continued to enjoy substantial political power during the reign of her son Tiberius. Here is a quotation from Dio Cassius, who is writing more than 200 years after the event, but is a reliable historian who had access to many sources that we now lack. She occupied a very exalted position, far above all women of former days, so that she could at any time receive the Senate and such of the people as wished to greet her in the house, and this fact was entered in the public records. The letters of Tiberius bore for a time her name also, and communications were addressed to both alike, except that she never ventured to enter the Senate chamber or the camps or the public assemblies. She undertook to manage everything as if she were sole ruler, for in the time of Augustus she had possessed the greatest influence, and she always declared that it was she who had made Tiberius emperor. Consequently, she was not satisfied to rule on equal terms with him, but wished to take precedence over him. That is Livia. This particular description of her is slightly coloured by the experience of Dio Cassius with a later empress, but it doesn't matter. We can take this as a reliable estimate of the position that Livia enjoyed in the time of Augustus, and here is further evidence. First, top left, you have an inscription where the people of Samos, an island in the Aegean, had asked Augustus for a grant of Roman citizenship for the island, and these people had Livia on their side. The inscription reads, Imperator Caesar Augustus, son of Divus Julius, wrote to the Samians underneath their petition, I am well disposed to you and should like to do a favour to my wife, who is active on your behalf. On this occasion, Augustus turned down their request, but did later on grant it, apparently at the urging of Livia. Here is a coin which circulated in the western provinces in the early years of Tiberius, which has Livia's head on it. Bottom left, you have a turquoise cameo of Livia and Tiberius. And here on the right, you have a cult statue of Livia. She was declared a god by Claudius, her grandson, after 41 AD, but this statue was set up before then. It may have been set up during her own lifetime or shortly after her death, when there had been no official grant of divinity by the Senate. It is a cult statue, and by that we can say that this is a statue put up in a place where the empress was worshipped as a god, or in her case as a goddess. Tacitus, on her death, sums her up as follows: an imperious mother and an amiable wife. She was a match for the diplomacy of her husband and the dissimulation of her son. Tacitus mentions that so long as Livia was alive, Tiberius was unable to show all of his despotic tendencies. He was forced to keep himself in some control because he was always frightened of his mother, even when he was not on very good terms with her. Whereas after her death, he appears to have ruled badly without restraint. Coming from here, Agrippina the Elder, the failure of these three women. She is the daughter of Julia and Agrippa. She is the granddaughter of Augustus. She is the wife of Germanicus, who was the grandson of Livia. She is the mother of Caligula and the grandmother of Nero. I've put that family tree at the end of these slides. Again, I'll say do study it, because you cannot understand the history of the early Roman Empire without having a decent knowledge of who was married to whom and who gave birth to whom, which is shown in these family trees. She had 9 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood, which is pretty good for those days. In 12 AD, her husband Germanicus was appointed commander-in-chief of the armies on the Rhine. That is a third of the entire Roman army, and it is the Roman army stationed on the empire's only really live frontier. In 14 AD, she helped Germanicus to quell a mutiny among the soldiers when they went on strike, demanding back pay and discharges for those who had completed their legal terms of service. In 15 AD, there was a flare-up on the northern banks of the Rhine. There was a hot war north of the Rhine with Germanic tribes. This went badly at first, and part of the army panicked and made a dash for a bridge back across the Rhine. And the idea was that these people would get back to the Roman territory and then cut down the bridge, which would stop the Germans from coming after them, but it would also cut off the majority of the Roman army, which was north of the Rhine. It's because Agrippina was there that she was able to stand up and force the soldiers not to do this. She was able, by force of her own personality, to quell this mutiny, I suppose you could call it, and to ensure that when her husband turned up with the remains of the army, they were able to get safely back into Roman territory. It is said that when Tiberius heard of this, he was rather angry and concerned, because a woman able to do this might be able to do many other things. Whatever the case, in 19 AD, Germanicus was sent out to the east to settle the eastern frontier, which he did with some success, but unfortunately he died in Antioch. Agrippina believed from the very first that he had been poisoned on orders of Tiberius. She came back to Rome and she assembled around her the entire opposition to Tiberius. For the next 10 years, from her return to Rome until the death of Livia, she was the acting head of the opposition. Although Sejanus, the prime minister of Tiberius, was deeply hostile to her, there were limits to what Sejanus could do, because Agrippina was the widow of Germanicus, she was the granddaughter of Augustus, and she had the passive protection of Livia, the old empress. It's only when Livia died in 29 AD that Tiberius, or Sejanus, felt able to move against her. She was then arrested, charged with treason, possibly a fictitious charge of treason, and packed off to the island of Pandateria, where she was starved to death, or she starved herself to death in protest at her confinement. She was a failure in politics in the sense that she was sent off to die, but for 10 years, as I said, she was the acting head of the opposition to Tiberius and Sejanus, and she managed that opposition with considerable ability. And although she never succeeded, and Tiberius did mock her for this at their last meeting, apparently Tiberius quoted a line, I think, from Euripides, "And if you're not queen, my dear, have I then done you any wrong?" Although she was not a success in the sense that she did not become empress, which was what Augustus himself had intended. Her son Caligula became the emperor, and her grandson Nero became the emperor. So another important woman in the imperial family. We then have Agrippina the Younger, 15 AD to 59 AD. And what do you say about Agrippina? She was the daughter of Germanicus and of Agrippina the Elder. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus and, I believe, of Mark Antony. She was married at 13 to her second cousin. They had only one child, Nero. Because she was the elder sister of Caligula, yes, she committed incest with him, or rather he committed incest with her, though looking at Agrippina's record it's very hard to say who committed incest with whom, but she enjoyed, if you can use that phrase, she enjoyed an incestuous relationship with her brother until he turned against her in 38 AD, accused her of plotting against him, which, bearing in mind what kind of woman she was, is not impossible, and he exiled her to the Pontine Islands in, I think, the Adriatic. In 41 AD, after the murder of her brother Caligula, she was recalled by Claudius, and then after that very strange coup attempt by his wife Messalina, Claudius in 49 AD gets the incest laws set aside by a special grant of the Senate, and he marries his niece Agrippina, and then he adopts her son Nero as his own son. And because Roman adoption was absolute, it meant that the adopted child stepped absolutely into the status of child. Because Nero was older than Claudius's actual son Britannicus, he became the effective heir to the empire. It seems that towards the end, Claudius realized that Nero and Agrippina were not quite the loving family he had hoped they would be, and he began to move towards putting his own son into the succession. At that point, Agrippina poisoned him and got Nero acclaimed emperor. Nero was only 17 when he was acclaimed emperor. He had no interest whatever in exercising political power. All he wanted was to be a famous singer and actor. So he made his tours of the Greek games, collecting all the prizes for singer and winning chariot races, even though, as I recall, the only time he did take part in a chariot race, he kept falling out of the chariot and had to be put back into it every so often. Doesn't matter, the judges still gave him first prize. That was Nero's main ambition, that and sex and lots of eating and drinking and general enjoyment. Reading tons of papyrus documents every day and having to deal with troop reinforcements on the Rhine frontier, or looking at the garrisoning of Alexandria. Those were not very important matters on his particular agenda, and luckily for him, his mother was perfectly willing to take over the whole running of the empire. She ran the empire for about the next 3 years. She ran the empire as regent, and Seneca the Younger, who was for a time her lover, was Nero's tutor, but he was also the prime minister. They ran the empire quite well together, while Nero concentrated on his musical career. Agrippina was officially on the same level as her son. She received kings and supplicants in her own right, and petitions were addressed to her, and she made all the appointments. In 57 AD, she fell out with Nero, and I'll discuss this next week when we start talking about Nero. But she fell out with Nero in and after 57 AD. She was then forced to leave Rome as her former allies turned against her. Seneca, he turned against her, and Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, he turned against her. They took Nero's side. Agrippina found it useful to withdraw from Rome. In 59 AD, she was murdered by Nero. She rather liked sea voyages, and she had a nice yacht built for her own use. Before we talk about the murder, let's look at some of this rather salacious stuff from Suetonius. There are rumours, and they only amount to rumours. Tacitus dismissed them as unfounded, and he was no fan of Nero. Suetonius relates them rather greedily, but then Suetonius was always fond of a salacious story. It is claimed that Agrippina slept with Nero as a means of keeping her control over him and the empire. Whether there's any truth in that, I am completely unable to say. But let me turn to the murder. This is when Nero decided that she was decidedly surplus to requirements. An ingenious suggestion was offered by Anicetus, a freedman, commander of the fleet at Misenum, who had been tutor to Nero in boyhood and had a hatred of Agrippina, which she reciprocated. He explained that a vessel could be constructed from which a part might by contrivance be detached when out to sea, so as to plunge her unawares into the water. Nothing, he said, allowed of accident so much as the sea, and should she be overtaken by shipwreck, who would be so unfair as to impute to crime an offence committed by the winds and waves? The emperor would add the honour of a temple and of shrines to the deceased lady, with every other display of filial affection. There's a number of stories about this. One of them is that her own yacht was repaired so that the ceiling in her own bedroom had a ton of lead plate just above it, and this was then made to collapse on her, but her bed was so built that the lead didn't kill her, it just injured her slightly and she was able to jump into the water. Another story is that this deconstructing ship that Anicetus mentioned did indeed deconstruct, throwing everyone into the water, but Agrippina was a strong swimmer and she got back to the shore. So she went back to her house, and it was necessary for Nero to send soldiers to murder her. So the assassins closed in round her couch, and the captain of the trireme first struck her head violently with a club. Then, as the centurion bared his sword for the fatal deed, presenting her person, she exclaimed, "Smite my womb!" and with many wounds she was slain. Those are the accounts in Tacitus. Here's a painting which shows the aftermath. Nero inspecting the body of Agrippina. Apparently he went down to see her body and he was pointing out its many beauties to the people who were with him at the time. They were a strange lot, the Imperial family, but top left on this slide you have a record of happier days when Nero and Agrippina are sharing the front of a coin. So there we have those imperial women. Obviously the most important and the most creative of these was Livia, the wife of Augustus. As I said, she is the woman who can be credited with some, or perhaps much, of the construction of the institutions under which the government was administered for the next 300 years. Livia did much to establish the imperial system as the natural constitution of the Roman world. She seems to have been of critical importance on the death of Augustus, which is something that she may have accomplished in any event, in ensuring the smooth transfer of power to her son Tiberius. She also maintained continuity in the administration of the system for at least the next 5 years by remaining at the head of affairs. Agrippina the Elder and Agrippina the Younger, they were less consistently successful than Livia, but they still enjoyed positions of considerable importance within the empire, and indeed in the case of Agrippina the Younger, within the day-to-day government of the empire. And so what we can say about the early imperial period is that although in theory women were subject to a very close supervision by men, by their male relatives or husbands, or simply by a male guardian, in practice those women who had the money and the personality were able to break free of these often admittedly notional restrictions and to become actors of the highest importance in the history and the administration of the empire. For those women who were not at the top of society, for those women at the bottom, for example, it was probably much the same as in every society. In most societies, let's face it, it doesn't matter whether women are legally as one with the family pets or the farm animals or the slaves, or if women theoretically have the same rights as men. It really makes no difference. For the poor, it doesn't matter what the law says. The facts are that you are in a position of subjection and you get by as best you can. But we don't know very much about the lives of the poor in the first century Roman Empire. We do know a lot, however, about the lives of the elite. And within the elite, although women could not become consuls and could not become generals and probably could not become emperors in their own right. The first one to do this was Irene around 800 AD, which doesn't count for our purposes. Although women suffered a number of legal discriminations. These did not prevent women from taking and making use of considerable power within the system. There we are, that's all I have to say about women, but we have time for questions and comments. There we are, I'll shut up.